Hi, David Stewart here. I am a writer in the fantasy and science fiction genres, and what I wanted to do tonight is just give out a little bit of a suggested reading list for people who aren't yet into fantasy but are looking to do a little bit of exploration in that genre, looking to maybe get into it and get some of the benefits that I talked about in my previous video, why you should read fantasy, namely really interesting settings, characters that are very unique and can't really be created outside of a fantasy setting, and of course plots that take a different kind of course than what is normally possible within a realist setting. I'm going to try to give you a lot of different styles, a lot of different perspectives, and a lot of different setting types so that you could find one that maybe appeals to you and try it out and do a little exploring. So the first one I'm going to talk about is The Hobbit. Okay, so good old JRR Tolkien, The Hobbit. When you're going to start with Tolkien, I actually recommend you start with The Hobbit, not with The Lord of the Rings. There's a couple reasons for that. I have my nice annotated edition of The Hobbit as well, with that dragon drawing by J.R.R. Tolkien. The reason I like The Hobbit, starting with The Hobbit, is first of all, that's where the story begins. It begins with The Hobbit, and it's continued really in Lord of the Rings. It's often thought of as a prelude to Lord of the Rings, but it's really like the beginning of the story. I like the style that it's written in. It's not written with a super heady, serious tone. It's not written with the more dense prose of Lord of the Rings. It's got sort of a storytelling manner to it. The narrator's kind of part of the style. He's very present in what's being said within the prose. It also is at a little bit lower reading level than Lord of the Rings. Now, when this came out way back in, I think, 1927, it was considered children's literature. But by today's standards, it would really be like a grade 13 kind of, or a grade 8 kind of 13-year-old would be able to read this, maybe. Most young adult fiction is written at a 4th grade reading level now, and this is actually at a higher reading level than the vast majority of modern young adult reading. So this might be like young adult level for kids could probably read this. I think the first time I read it was I was 10 or 11. I'm a pretty advanced reader though, so this wasn't too much sweat. I absolutely loved it when I first read it, and this is the book that got me into fantasy and made me love the genre from there on out. It's got a lot of great adventure. It's really hard to be bored with the book because there's so much stuff that goes on. You're introduced to so many different races within the Tolkien universe: elves, dwarves, wizards, goblins, aka orcs. It ends with a great climactic battle, and it's structured just very, very well. Each chapter tells a small part of the story. It really is like a chapter of the story, and each chapter something very important happens to move them along. Really, really great adventure novel. Highly recommend starting there if you're going to be interested in high fantasy. The reason I don't recommend starting with Lord of the Rings is the prose is a little more dense, and modern readers may not be super used to the kind of prose that Tolkien uses. It's written in a much more, formal style than what most popular fiction is written in these days. And then, of course, if you were to read Silmarillion's even less accessible. So this is the most accessible Tolkien book, so I recommend starting there. And then you can go on to the less accessible ones if you like this one. So a great place to start. I like my little edition. It's also one of these early ones that has lots of fun maps that were drawn by Tolkien. I showed you the annotated version, had drawings done by Tolkien, so if you could find an illustrated version with Tolkien's drawings, he drew them, then you might like that as well. That's Smaug, and my son really likes that picture, by the way. The next one I'll give you is sort of on the other side of classic fantasy, and that is Elric of Melnibone. I made an entire video on this particular series and this particular book. I love the cover art. This is one of Michael Whalen's early covers. This is, I said it's kind of on the opposite side of Tolkien. This is a lot darker. It's a lot more adult, so to speak. The language is simple and it's easy to read though, so it's really easy to get into it. The pacing's very, very fast. You go through the story in a quick manner. And the prose is functional. It's not designed to be super, super beautiful, but at certain points there are moments of good prose. It's mainly about the story. And this sort of takes heroic fiction to sort of the next level, or it did back in the day. And if you want to think of heroic fiction, you can look at also the books of Robert E. Howard, which I do recommend. I don't necessarily recommend those for people who are brand new to fantasy, but this one, I think if you're new to fantasy, this one, because it's a different style than what you normally get, you may get really drawn in. This was originally from the 60s. I think this edition is actually from the 70s, but the character Elric was came out when Michael Moorcock was publishing stories about him a long time ago in the 60s. So very opposite sides if you look at it in a historical context between Lord of the Rings and Elric and Michael Moorcock. The next one that I'm going to suggest, you may be surprised for me to suggest, and that is The Gunslinger by Stephen King. Most people don't think of Stephen King as a fantasy author. They think of him as a horror writer, but he does a lot of fantasy type stuff as well. He also did a book called Eyes of the Dragon, which is like a fairy tale, but it's basically a fantasy story. This is more like, I don't know, a little closer to low fantasy, or maybe it's not really urban fantasy, but there's urban fantasy elements. This really predates before people were really doing urban fantasy. Essentially, there's parts of it that take place on our world. There's parts that take place on this other world that I find very, very interesting. The first book in the series, The Gunslinger, the whole series is called The Dark Tower, by the way. I find this first book really, really good. I love the style of it. He doesn't lay anything out for you and explain everything. He just kind of brings you through the story, and you're left kind of wondering what this or that is, and you have to kind of piece it together as you go, which I think was a really, really cool experience. It drew me in. I bought it on a whim one day, and I absolutely loved this first book. I think that the series is overall not my favorite, especially the final volumes. I don't really like the way that everything kind of pans out. I don't really like it from a structural perspective. This one is a little more structured, and I think makes a little more sense, as are some of the other first 3 or 4 books. But you know what? If that appeals to you, the idea of a post-apocalyptic cowboy, which is what this is about, so it's post-apocalyptic Western, that might totally be your game, and you might enjoy that. A lot of people I know got into fantasy through this series and then started looking at more high fantasy stuff because they got drawn into the fantasy elements in this book. So I do recommend this one. That's The Gunslinger by Stephen King. Let's talk about some other ones as well. I don't have a physical copy here, but Stormfront by Jim Butcher. Not my favorite series. It's the Dresden Files, but a lot of people really love it, and it got a lot of people into fantasy. It's written from a first-person perspective, like a detective novel. In fact, they are kind of like detective novels, but there's a bunch of magic and fantasy elements within it. It would be a great example of low fantasy or urban fantasy, and it's tremendously influential on a lot of people. There's a lot of copycats out there trying to do what Jim Butcher does, but I recommend you just start with Jim Butcher, Stormfront. It's a very, very fast-paced book from beginning to end. It's got a lot of action, and it's got a lot of interesting things going on in it. So even if it's doesn't end up being your bag, you may end up really enjoying the read, or at least appreciate the structure and how well the entire story pans out. So that's Stormfront by Jim Butcher. I don't have a physical copy right here in front of me. Another one, also in the first-person perspective. A lot of people really connect with first-person perspective, I notice. I don't usually like first-person perspective, but I read books in first-person perspective if they have a good story. So this one is Robert Zelazny's Amber. There's actually 10 books. This is an omnibus of all 10 Amber books, and I think there's actually more than 10, but I haven't read the extra ones. So Robert Zelazny wrote these. They are in a first-person perspective. The first book starts off with a bit of amnesia, and then you sort of discover that there's this other world called Amber, and that the main character is not who he was led to believe he was, and things sort of expand from there. There's a lot of craziness that happens in the books, and the prose is very dry, and it's written in a first-person perspective. It's very, very functional. It doesn't spend a lot of time with frilly words the way that Tolkien might to say something, and that might be what you really like. If you like a story to be hammered out quick and to have a lot of stuff happening, then I think Zelazny does it well. Each book in the series is fairly short, but is pretty effective and has a decent little structure to it. So this is another one that I think a lot of people can get into and really enjoy without having to have a lot of other experience in the fantasy genre. I think it pulls you through everything quite nicely and doesn't rely on any sort of past experiences or past preferences for aesthetics to kind of draw you in. Another one from a first-person perspective, if you want to get into more dark fantasy, this is Black Company by Glen Cook. This is actually the first 3 books. There are, I think, 9. So I think there's 3 sets of 3. This is the North Chronicles. What I love about this is that the characters in this are basically working for the bad guy, which is great. So they're on the side of the bad guys, and they're mercenaries, and they're not too, they're a little conflicted over what's going on. But it really gives you the perspective of wanting like the bad guys to win in a certain sense, and really digging into the darker side of things. In Lord of the Rings, you don't really get to know Sauron. In Black Company, you really get to know the bad guys, and that's pretty cool. So I like this. It is written from a first-person perspective, but it does have more elaborate prose than Amber. Tremendously influential. Without Black Company, you probably wouldn't have like Malazan, Book of the Fallen, or some of the other darker fantasy stuff that's out there, or grimdark fantasy. Very influential on that. And I also just think they're good books, and I think they really, really suck you in quick and really make you want to figure out how things go at the end. And certainly the first book ends with a great, great climax that is just really, really a lot of fun to read. The next one I'll mention, again, I don't have a physical copy of this one to show you, is going to be Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. And there's a 3-part series. I think it's called The Final Empire. I'm not sure if The Final Empire is the first book or Mistborn's the first book. Anyway, the series is called Mistborn, The Final Empire. And this is a really, really good one to get you into sort of the modern style of fantasy. So if you like modern contemporary prose and narrative style, then Mistborn is a really, really good place to enter the fantasy genre, because it's got a familiar style, familiar modern style, and it's very, very well structured. However, it's got really, really good fantasy. And what I love about Brandon Sanderson, I've talked about this in other videos, he creates magic systems that are really effective in creating a rule set that you will understand sort of like as if it's science in that particular universe. And this is more about not destroying limitations, but sort of rebuilding them, and then sort of creating characters and plot that have to deal with those enhanced limitations, those rule sets, so to speak. So the characters feel like, you always feel like the characters are in danger and that they can't just use magic to get out of whatever thing, but they use magic all the time, and that's because the limits of magic are really well defined. So I really recommend you do him if you're like if you're into more contemporary fiction, and if you're not into more contemporary fiction, I still think he's a really, really good author, and he understands his craft very, very well. I would also possibly recommend Way of Kings. Way of Kings is really, really good. It's probably better. I think it's better than Mistborn. However, I think that one may not be the best one to start with if you've never read any fantasy. So if you like Mistborn, you'll like Way of Kings. Way of Kings might be the other suggestion to start with. But it's a little bit more complicated, and there's a little bit more to it, especially with that first book, and a lot more unanswered questions, and that may not be quite up your alley if you're not used to fantasy that develops over multiple volumes. A couple of other honorable mentions, or actually, before I talk about honorable mentions, let's talk about stuff for younger readers. I forgot to bring down the physical copy I have for this, but Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander is a really, really good series that I recommend for younger readers. And if you're an adult and maybe you have a kid that you want to try reading a story to, it's good. It's a high fantasy story. It's sort of based on Welsh mythology. You have the 5 books, and over the course of that 5 books, you have this boy Taran basically grow into a hero, and it really does a really good job of that. And in particular, I really love the 4th volume in the series for the way that it sort of built this character growth. But it starts with a lot of whimsy. It has a lot of fun elements to it. You get to sort of see all your favorite characters come back volume after volume, even if the coincidence for them showing up is a little bit too strong. I still recommend it, and I don't think younger readers would really be upset about that. And it's a great way to sort of explore that genre a little bit with your child, if you want to read it to a child, or if you just like reading children's literature. I do recommend that one. It's been kind of forgotten. However, you should know also that it was made loosely. There was a Disney film that was loosely based on them called The Black Cauldron that almost ruined Disney. And it almost ruined Disney because it's still a little bit dark, and they had a pretty dark interpretation of these books. And that didn't quite work out for Disney's image in the mid 1980s. But I do recommend the books. I think the books are better than the movie, and I think that they'd be great for young readers. Also worth mentioning, I mean, it's almost tropic. Is Harry Potter, or almost a cliche now, I should say, not tropic, but a cliche, is to say talk about Harry Potter. Harry Potter is basically like kids low fantasy or kids urban fantasy, about, you know, you should know what it's about by now. It's been millions of dollars, but it's not a bad place to start reading fantasy. If you were into the movies, you could try reading the books and see what you think about them. And if you like those, you could try the Chronicles of Prydain, or Prydain, however you want to pronounce it. And I think those are good. A couple of honorable mentions. You know, I mentioned Way of Kings. There's also the massive monolithic series called Malazan Book of the Fallen. I don't recommend that for rookies, because it relies on a lot on the reader to really want to explore a setting, and you don't get a lot of conclusions to storylines right away. But that one is a really, really good piece of craft. Obviously, Wheel of Time is an honorable mention, not because I think it's bad for rookies. I think the first book is great for rookies. However, the series gets pretty bad about book 6. Book 6 through like book 9 or book 10, the books aren't very interesting. They start to become really boring and not fun or exciting the way that the first 3 or 4 volumes were. So beware of Wheel of Time. I think, you know, you can take a chance on it if you want and read the first volume. I think the first volume is really, really well written, and it's really exciting and really fun, and will introduce you to a lot of tropes of fantasy without like sort of hammering you over the head with them or making them feel cheesy or anything like that. Possibly also, I mean, there's a million fantasy books out there that you could get into and choose to read, but those are sort of the ones that I think are good for drawing people into fantasy. I think some people were getting drawn in by like Game of Thrones. Maybe that's an honorable mention. I personally do not prefer Game of Thrones. It's not my style of story or my style of writing, and I don't really like the TV series either. But if that gets you into fantasy, if there's elements in there that really appeal to you, you know, that's something that could deliver a lot of those fantasy elements to you, even though it's not really the style that I particularly like. Anyway, thanks so much for watching and listening, and I hope you guys will have a great, great day. I wrote also a historical fantasy novel, and if you're wondering like what historical fantasy is, think of like Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court. It's kind of like the first historical fantasy novel written by Mark Twain, and it's basically you know, history takes place in a particular time and place in history, but does not pretend that magic doesn't exist in that time or place. The magic or the religion is real. And that's the way I approach mine. It's like the religion part, the demon part, that's real. The superstitions are real, and otherwise it takes place within late Muromachi period Japan. I think the actual year was 1511. Muramasa Blood Drinker, you can find it down below, and I always appreciate you leaving your comments, and I will see you next time. You guys have a great, great night.